Beacon Station hung like a solitary jewel against the vast shifting tapestry of the Etherian veil. From a distance, the veil was breathtaking, a cosmic cloud of iridescent gases, glowing nebulae, and the faint, ghostly shimmer of stars being born and dying. Up close, for those who lived and worked on the station, its beauty was laced with a thread of ancient dread. It was a place of wonders, yes, but also a place where the fabric of reality sometimes felt thin, and whispers of the Chronomists were never far from mind. Inside Beacon Station, life hummed with a steady, controlled rhythm. Dr. Lena Hanson, however, often found herself out of sync with that rhythm. Her workstation in the xenolinguistics lab was a controlled chaos of data screens, holographic projections of complex symbols, and stacks of actual, old-fashioned digital readers. Currently, she was engrossed in a recently declassified Cathar, historical text, its alien script scrolling slowly across her largest monitor. The official translation was dry, academic, but Lena was reading between the lines, looking for the echoes of fear, the raw experience of encountering the Chronomists. Faint chime announced a new message. Lena glanced at it, a general station update about upcoming maintenance schedules. She dismissed it with a sigh. Everyone was so focused on the mundane, the predictable. It was how the galaxy coped with the truly unpredictable. By pretending it wasn't there, or by wrapping it in layers of sterile terminology. Still chasing ghosts, Dr. Hanson? Lena looked up. Commander Jax Moreau stood in the doorway of her lab, a data slate in hand, his expression one of mild amusement mixed with his usual professional scrutiny. He was a man who seemed to carry the weight of the station lightly on his broad shoulders, his dark hair neatly trimmed, his uniform impeccable. "Someone has to, Commander," Lena replied, offering a slight smile. "The official reports on Chronomist encounters are clinically unhelpful. They list the damages, the temporal displacement figures, but they barely touch the experiential data." Jax stepped inside, his gaze sweeping over her cluttered workspace. Experiential data is hard to quantify, and harder still when the experience is profound, species-specific terror. He tapped his slate. "Speaking of which, Zirzan has lodged another polite Cathar-style inquiry about our proximity to the unsettled currents of the Veil. He's worried we're not taking the local folklore seriously enough." Lena leaned back in her chair. Zirzan, Beacon Station's Cathar cultural liaison and astrophysicist, was a constant reminder of that folklore. He was a tall, willowy being, his skin a canvas of subtle bioluminescent patterns that shifted and swirled with his emotions. Lately, those patterns had been muted, often flickering with hues Lena had come to associate with anxiety. The Cathar
have every right to be cautious, Lena conceded. Their historical records are filled with genuine trauma. But fear can also be a blinder, Commander.
What if the Chronomists aren't the boogeymen everyone thinks they are? What if there's something more to them, something we're missing because we're too afraid to look? Jax raised an eyebrow. More. Like what? A hidden benevolence? Forgive my skepticism, Doctor, but entities that randomly warp time and cause widespread panic don't usually top my list of misunderstood philanthropists. "I'm not suggesting they're handing out candy," Lena said, a touch of frustration in her voice. "But their actions, they're always described as chaotic, random. Yet the universe, at its fundamental level, isn't truly random. There are always underlying patterns, even in chaos theory. What if we've just never had the tools or the courage to find them in the Chronomist's wake?" Commander Moreau considered her words for a moment. He didn't dismiss her out of hand, which was one of the reasons Lena respected him. He was a military man, yes, but his mind wasn't closed. "Courage is one thing, Dr. Hanson. Resources are another. Beacon Station is primarily an observation and research facility, not a first contact unit for entities that break physics for breakfast." "I understand that, sir," Lena said. "But observation is what I do, and I'm observing data that suggests inconsistencies, moments in past encounters where the temporal effects weren't entirely destructive, almost responsive in a way." Before Jax could reply, his personal comm chimed. He glanced at it, his expression shifting subtly. "I have to take this. We'll talk more later, Doctor." Try not to awaken any sleeping gods before lunchtime, all right? He gave a curt nod and was gone. Lena watched him go, then turned back to her screens. Sleeping gods. That was the Cathar proverb Zirzan had shared with her last week. It is unwise to shout at sleeping gods, you may not like what awakens. The Cathar were an old species, their wisdom rooted in millennia of survival. But humanity, Lena mused, had always had a tendency to not just shout at sleeping gods but to poke them with a stick out of sheer curiosity. Later that shift, Lena found Zirzan in the station's arboretum, a dome filled with Terran and Cathar flora. He was standing before a cluster of earth ferns, his long, delicate fingers hovering just above a frond. The bioluminescent patterns on his skin were a calm, pulsing blue, a rare sight these days. They are fascinating, are they not? Zirzan said without turning, his voice a soft, melodic baritone. Such primitive resilience. They have survived eons on your world, through countless cataclysms. They're good at adapting, Lena replied, joining him. It's a useful trait. Zirzan finally turned, his large, dark eyes regarding her. Adaptation, yes, but your species also possesses a proactive inquisitiveness that my people find unsettling at times, especially in regions like the Etherian Veil. His skin patterns flickered with a momentary wash of violet, unease. You're worried about my research into the Chronomists, Lena stated gently. Concerned, Dr. Hanson, Zirzan corrected. The veil is named such for a reason. Some things are best left veiled. The Chronomists are not a puzzle to be solved. They are a storm to be weathered, preferably from a great distance. And if the storm has patterns? Lena pressed softly. If understanding it could help us predict its path or even calm its winds. Zirzan's bioluminescence shimmered. You speak of calming a supernova with a whisper, Doctor. The Chronomists are forces beyond our comprehension. To seek patterns in their chaos is to invite their attention. And their attention is rarely benign. The weight of his words, of his species' ancient fear, settled in the quiet air of the arboretum. Lena knew he wasn't trying to be obstructive. He was genuinely afraid for himself, for the station, perhaps even for the brash young species that was humanity. But within her, a different kind of weight was building, the weight of unanswered questions, of a mystery so profound it eclipsed even the fear. And Lena Hanson was, by her very nature, compelled to try and lift it. The whispers of the Chronomists might be terrifying to others, but to her they were a siren song of the unknown. The relative tranquility of Beacon Station, already frayed by its proximity to the Etherian Veil, shattered 3 days later. It began not with a bang, but with a burst of distorted sound and fractured light on the main communication console of the command deck. Commander Jax Moreau was reviewing sensor logs from an automated deep space probe when the alert blared, a high-priority distress signal, heavily degraded but flagged as Cathar in origin. Every head on the bridge snapped towards the comm station. Source, Lieutenant? Jax barked, already moving towards the console. Triangulating, Commander. Origin appears to be Viridian outpost, sir, replied Lieutenant Chen, his fingers flying across his control panel. Signal is heavily corrupted. Chronometric interference patterns detected. A chill went through the command deck. Viridian outpost, a Cathar agricultural colony, one of the few permanent settlements brave enough, or perhaps desperate enough, to establish itself within the Veil's unpredictable currents. And chronometric interference was a sanitized term for only one thing. Put it on main speakers, what you can salvage, Jax ordered, his voice tight. A crackle of static filled the air, then a voice, high-pitched and strained, speaking rapidly in the melodic cadence of the Cathar language. The universal translator struggled, spitting out broken phrases. Unraveling, time itself, the light, it bends. Chronomists, cannot hold. Mother of stars, they are upon us. Viridian, screams. Then, silence. An abrupt chilling, where the desperate voice had been. The signal was gone. Jack stared at the comms panel, his jaw tight. Around him, the bridge crew was frozen, the usual calm efficiency replaced by a stark shared apprehension. Status of Viridian outpost? No signal, Commander, Chen reported, his voice hushed. Complete transmission loss. Long-range scans show anomalous energy readings in that sector, consistent with high-level temporal distortion. Zirzan arrived on the bridge moments later, drawn by the urgent summons. His usual graceful movements were clipped, agitated. When Chen replayed the salvaged recording, the bioluminescent patterns on Zirzan's skin erupted into a chaotic, sickly yellow-green. He swayed, one hand reaching out to grip the back of a vacant console for support. "Viridian," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "My cousin's youngest daughter was stationed there, on her first agricultural assignment." Jax's gaze softened for a fraction of a second as he looked at the distressed Cathar, then hardened again with resolve. "Lieutenant, are there any other Cathar vessels or outposts within support range of Viridian?" Chen shook his head. "Negative, Commander. Viridian was the furthest Cathar presence in this quadrant. They're isolated. Standard protocol dictates we maintain our position and gather data," Jax said, thinking aloud, the burden of command heavy on him. "Sending a ship into an active Chronomist event is ill-advised." He looked at Zirzan, whose patterns pulsed with a grief that was painful to watch. The Cathar were a private people, their emotions usually veiled, but this was raw. "Commander," Lena Hanson's voice cut through the tense atmosphere. She had clearly heard the commotion from her nearby lab and had come to the bridge entrance. "Are we detecting any residual, structured elements from the Chronomist activity around Viridian? Anything beyond the usual chaotic signatures?" Several heads turned towards her, some with irritation at what seemed like an academic question in a moment of crisis. Zirzan looked at her as if she'd spoken in tongues. "Structured elements?" he echoed, his voice trembling. "Doctor, my people are likely perishing, their reality torn apart. There is no structure in the maw of a Chronomist." "With respect, Zirzan," Lena said, her tone calm but firm, stepping further onto the bridge. "We don't know that for certain. If there's any chance of understanding what's happening, even to help others avoid it in the future, we need all possible data." Jax held up a hand. "Dr. Hanson has a point, Zirzan. While our immediate concern is the fate of Viridian, any information we can glean might be vital. Comms. Focus all available sensor arrays on the Viridian sector. Prioritize any unusual energy fluctuations, any patterns that deviate from previously recorded Chronomist events, however minor." "Commander," Zirzan implored, his voice regaining some strength. "Surely sending a probe, a long-range scout, on something must be done we cannot simply unobserve." His desperation was a stark contrast to his usual composed demeanor. "A probe would likely be lost, Zirzan. Its data corrupted before it even got close," Jax said, his tone regrettably blunt but necessary. "And a manned scout ship. I will not risk my crew venturing into an active, high-intensity Chronomist field without a clear objective and a reasonable chance of success or survival. Right now we have neither." His gaze was fixed on the main view screen, now displaying a swirling mass of distorted sensor data from the Viridian sector. It looked like a wound in spacetime. Lena moved closer to a secondary science station, her eyes already scanning the incoming telemetry. "The energy signature is one immense," she murmured, more to herself than anyone else. "But the fall-off gradient is unusually sharp, and there are microvariances in the temporal distortion field, almost like interference ripples." Jax watched. A flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. He knew Lena's theories. He also knew the official galactic stance. Chronomists were anathema, a destructive force of nature. But Viridian Outpost was silent, its inhabitants feared lost, and standard protocol offered little comfort and no solutions. The weight of those lost Cathar, and the potential for the threat to spread, pressed down on him. He had to protect Beacon Station, but the silence from Viridian felt like a judgment. The air on the bridge remained thick with unspoken fears, and the heavy thrum of the station's engines, a tiny bastion of order against the encroaching chaos of the Etherian Veil. And out in the deep, The anomaly at Viridian continued to pulse, a silent, terrifying testament to the power of the Chronomists. The days following the Viridian outpost silence were wrapped in a shroud of tension aboard Beacon Station. The Chronomist entity, or whatever it was that had silenced the Cathar colony, didn't immediately dissipate. Instead, its influence seemed to linger, a malevolent stain in the fabric of the Etherian veil. Worse, subtle but undeniable signs of its proximity began to manifest on Beacon Station itself. It started small. Clocks on corridor walls would flicker, displaying times minutes or even hours off from the station's master chronometer before suddenly snapping back. Lights in little-used storage bays were reported to dim and brighten in unsettling, arrhythmic pulses. Then came the personal experiences. Crew members spoke in hushed tones of sudden, overwhelming waves of déjà vu, or moments of profound disorientation where familiar corridors seemed subtly wrong. The angles subtly shifted. Commander Jax Moreau found himself dealing with a rising tide of anxiety among the crew. He ordered extra shifts for the engineering teams, tasked with constantly monitoring and recalibrating the station's delicate systems against the creeping temporal instability. The station's internal comms buzzed with status reports, system diagnostics, and more than a few thinly veiled expressions of fear. Zir-san had retreated into a state of quiet grief and hypervigilance. His bioluminescent skin remained a turbulent landscape of muted, anxious colors. He spent most of his time in the astrophysics lab, poring over sensor data from the Viridian sector, as if by sheer force of will he could find a sign of survivors, or at least an explanation that fit within the Cathar understanding of their ancient enemy. He avoided Lena Hanson, his usual polite interactions replaced with a curt nod if they passed in a corridor. The idea of looking for patterns in the face of such devastation clearly still felt like a sacrilege to him. Lena, meanwhile, was a whirlwind of focused energy. She practically lived in her lab, surrounded by holographic displays that shimmered with complex equations and rapidly scrolling lines of code. The data streams from Beacon Station's own sensors, now subtly corrupted by the nearby Chronomist, presence were a chaotic mess, but to Lena, chaos was just a complex system waiting to be understood. "There," she exclaimed late one cycle, startling her two research assistants, young ensigns named Petrov and Ananya, who were struggling to filter coherent information from the sensor noise. Lena pointed to a wildly fluctuating graph on her main screen. "Look at the decay signature of those micro-voltage spikes in Sector Gamma 7. They're not random. There's a periodicity, a repeating sequence, almost like a harmonic echo." Petrov squinted at the display. "Ma'am, with all due respect, that looks like system interference from the temporal flux." "It is interference," Lena agreed, her eyes bright with an intensity that bordered on feverish. "But it's patterned interference. The Chronomist field isn't just throwing out random temporal garbage. It's interacting with our station's energy field, with our technology, in a way that produces echoes. And these echoes have structure." She brought up another display, this one showing data from the initial Viridian event. "I found similar structures in the final, garbled transmissions from Viridian, just before they went silent." Everyone dismissed it as data corruption, but it's too consistent across both events to be mere chance. Ananya, always the more theoretically inclined of the two, leaned closer. "What kind of structure, Doctor?" "Mathematical," Lena breathed, tapping commands into her console. New projections flared to life, showing elegant spiraling geometric forms derived from the echoes, sequences that resemble fractal dimensions, interwoven with what look like variations on prime number distributions. It's incredibly complex, almost like a language or the byproduct of a consciousness operating on principles we haven't even conceived of. Commander Moreau chose that moment for one of his check-ins. He stood in the doorway, taking in the scene. Lena, vibrant and energized, her assistants looking on with a mixture of confusion and dawning curiosity, and the room alive, with glowing alien-seeming mathematics. "Making progress, Dr. Hanson?" Jax asked, his voice carefully neutral. The reports of temporal anomalies on the station were increasing. A section of the hydroponics bay had experienced a localized time dilation, aging a week's worth of crops into withered husks within minutes. Fear was a palpable current running through the station. "I believe so, Commander," Lena said, turning to him, her usual composure tinged with the thrill of discovery. "The Chronomist entity. It's not just a blind force, it's generating identifiable repeating patterns. Complex ones, I think it might be the key." Jax looked at the geometric forms swirling in the air. "The key to what, Doctor? Understanding it? Or just admiring its pretty pictures while it tears us apart?" The strain of command was beginning to show in the slight shadows under his eyes. "The key to interacting with it," Lena said, her voice dropping slightly as if acknowledging the audacity of her own words. "If it's generating patterns, it means there's an underlying order. And if there's order, there's a possibility of communication, or at least a way to influence it that isn't just about putting up stronger shields." Zirzan appeared behind Jax, his expression grim. He had obviously overheard. "Influence a chronomist?" he interjected, his voice tight with disbelief and a fresh wave of alarm that made his skin patterns flare a stark warning crimson. "Doctor, you are treading on ground from which my people have learned through bitter eons to flee. These are not entities one influences. They are events one survives, if one is fortunate." Lena met the Cathar's gaze, her own unwavering. "And how many have been fortunate, Zirzan? How many worlds, how many ships have been lost because we only know how to run or hide? Perhaps it's time to try something different." The silence in the lab was heavy, charged with the conflict between ingrained fear and radical hope. The pretty pictures on Lena's screens continued to swirl, a silent testament to the mystery that lay just beyond their understanding, a mystery that was now lapping at the very hull of Beacon Station. Jax looked from Lena's fiercely determined face to Zirzan's pained and fearful one, the weight of his impending decisions pressing down. The static was getting louder, and soon he would have to choose what signal to listen to. The emergency briefing took place in Beacon Station's primary conference room. Commander Jax Moreau sat at the head of the polished table, flanked by his senior officers. Dr. Lena Hanson was present, a data slate clutched in her hands, its surface alive with the complex patterns she had isolated. Zirzan sat opposite her, his posture rigid, his bioluminescent skin a carefully controlled neutral blue that failed to completely mask the agitated thrum beneath. The station was on high alert. The temporal disturbances had escalated. In the last 12 hours, a research lab in Deck 5 had its local time abruptly jump forward by 6 hours, ruining delicate experiments, and the primary atmospheric regulator for Deck 3 had briefly flickered, out of phase, causing a terrifying though quickly resolved pressure drop. Fear was no longer a whisper. It was a tightening knot in the pit of every stomach. "Dr. Hanson," Jax began, his voice calm and measured, cutting through the tense silence. "You've requested this meeting to present a theory regarding the Chronomist entity. Given the current situation, I expect it to be more than academic curiosity." Lena nodded, her gaze sweeping across the faces at the table, a mixture of skepticism, anxiety, and weary professionalism. "Commander, members of the staff, what I'm about to propose will sound unconventional, perhaps even dangerous, but I believe it's our only viable path forward other than evacuation, which itself carries enormous risks in the Etherian Veil." She activated her slate, projecting a 3D model of the Chronomist-induced patterns into the center of the table. The elegant, spiraling forms twisted and pulsed. "As you know, I've identified repeating complex mathematical structures within the temporal distortions affecting both Viridian Outpost and now Beacon Station. My hypothesis is this. The Chronomists are not acting with intentional malice, nor are they purely chaotic. I believe they are vast extra-dimensional intelligences, and these temporal effects are side effects of their presence in or interaction with our four-dimensional spacetime." A murmur ran around the table. The chief engineer, a pragmatic woman named Kira Volkov, frowned. "Side effects, Doctor? Those side effects are tearing Viridian apart and threatening to do the same to us." "I understand, Chief Volkov," Lena said. "But consider this. If you were a being that existed in, say, 5 or 6 spatial dimensions, your normal movement might cause bizarre, localized distortions. In a three-dimensional universe, without any hostile intent on your part, you might not even be fully aware of the lower beings you were affecting. She paused, letting that sink in. Furthermore, the patterns, they are too ordered, too intricate to be random. I believe they might be an inherent aspect of the Chronomists' existence, perhaps a form of passive communication, or even the sound their consciousness makes as it processes reality. A sound we are only now beginning to detect. Zir-san finally spoke, his voice resonating with the ancient fear of his people. Doctor, with all due respect to your intellect, what you are suggesting is beyond reckless. The Cathar have studied the Chronomists for millennia. We have concluded they are anathema, forces of cosmic destruction. To suggest they are communicating is to ignore generations of suffering and loss. His skin flickered, a distressed amber. And with all due respect, Liaison Zir-san, Lena countered, her voice firm but not aggressive. Those millennia of study have focused on defense, on shielding, on fleeing. Has anyone, any species ever tried to respond to these patterns? To engage with them on their own terms? The room was silent. The implications of her question hung heavy in the air. What exactly are you proposing, Dr. Hanson? Jax asked, his eyes fixed on Lena. This was the crux. Lena took a deep breath. I propose that Beacon Station attempts to broadcast a signal directly at the Chronomist entity. Not a weapon, not a shield modulation, but a message. A message composed of the same mathematical language we are detecting from it. Sequences of prime numbers, fractal geometries, perhaps even anonymized cognitive data streams representing fundamental concepts like curiosity, order, and empathy. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the faint hum of the station's life support. Then Zir-san shot to his feet, his bioluminescence flaring a brilliant, angry crimson. This is madness, he declared, his voice shaking. You propose to shout at the entity that destroyed Viridian, to draw its full attention upon us? This is not science. It is an invitation to annihilation. Commander, you cannot seriously consider this. Jax held up a hand, his expression unreadable. Zir-san, please. Dr. Hanson, what are the projected risks? The risks are significant, Lena admitted, meeting his gaze directly. We don't know how it will react. It could ignore us. It could intensify its disruptive effects. It could, as Zir-san fears, interpret our signal as a threat. But we also don't know the risks of not acting. The entity is clearly not dissipating. Its effects are worsening. Evacuation through the veil, with a chronomist active nearby, could be just as dangerous, scattering our ships and making them easy targets for temporal disruption. She looked around the table. This is the why not try this ridiculously dangerous thing moment. We are faced with an impossible threat. Conventional responses have failed for centuries across the galaxy. Human history is filled with leaps of faith, with attempting the impossible because all other avenues were exhausted. I believe this is one of those times. Commander Moreau leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled before him. The weight of the decision was immense. On one hand, the ingrained caution of every spacefarer, the chilling historical accounts, the very real fear of his crew. On the other, Lena Hanson's audacious, terrifying, yet strangely compelling hypothesis, and the dawning realization that doing nothing was a slow death sentence. He thought of the silent Cathar colony, of the flickering lights and skipping clocks on his own station. Your hypothesis is unthinkable, Doctor, Jack said slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. Then louder, for the whole room to hear. And that might be exactly why it's worth considering. Zir-san sank back into his chair, his crimson glow dimming to a bruised purple, a look of profound despair on his alien features. The fate of Beacon Station now rested on a human tendency towards the audaciously optimistic, a trait the Cathar had never truly understood, and now deeply feared. The decision, once made, set Beacon Station abuzz with a frenetic, nervous energy. Commander Jax Moreau had authorized Dr. Lena Hanson's experiment, codenamed Project Echo, under the strictest possible safety protocols. The mood among the crew, was a strange cocktail of fear, fatalistic curiosity, and for some, a defiant spark of hope. This was it. Humanity's bizarre tendency to poke the cosmic bear, armed with mathematics and a hunch. Lena and her small team, now augmented by some of the station's top engineers and cyberneticists, worked around the clock in the main communications control center. The plan was to use the station's powerful long-range transmission array, normally reserved for deep space telemetry or emergency beacons, to send Lena's carefully constructed message towards the shimmering space-time distortion that marked the Chronomist's presence. Chief Engineer Kira Volkov, initially one of the most vocal skeptics, now threw herself into the technical challenges with grim determination. "If we're going to do this insane thing," she'd grumbled to Jax, "we're going to do it with the most precisely calibrated insanity possible." Modifying the array to emit complex mathematical sequences interwoven with conceptual data from anonymized neural nets was no small feat. The power requirements alone were enormous, diverting energy from non-essential systems and pushing the station's primary fusion core close to its limits. Lena was a constant presence, her eyes alight with an almost manic focus. She triple-checked every sequence, every algorithm. The message wasn't words, but pure concept. Prime number cascades to signify intelligence, fractal equations to demonstrate an understanding of complex, self-referential systems, and carefully filtered emotional data, the raw cognitive patterns of human curiosity, the desire for understanding, even a touch of abstract empathy, stripped of all individual identity. It was a shot in the darkest room imaginable. "Are you sure about the empathy inclusion, Doctor?" Jax asked during one of his many check-ins. He stood amidst the controlled chaos of the control center, cables snaking across the floor, technicians hunched over consoles. The station lights seemed to flicker more erratically now. The air itself felt charged. Lena paused, a stylus hovering over a holographic display. "As sure as I can be about any of this, Commander. If the Chronomists are truly conscious, even in a way we can't comprehend, then perhaps a signal that denotes non-aggression, a willingness to connect, might be recognizable. Even if empathy isn't in their vocabulary, the pattern of a mind, reaching out without malice might be." The preparations were not without incident. Halfway through a critical power-up sequence for the array, a section of the engineering deck experienced a severe temporal stutter. For nearly 30 terrifying seconds, time in that section looped, the same 5 seconds of activity replaying, over and over before snapping back to normal, leaving the engineers disoriented and equipment alarmingly out of sync. Jax addressed the crew over the station-wide comms, his voice a rock of calm in the rising sea of anxiety. "I know many of you are apprehensive," he said, his image appearing on monitors throughout the station. "What we are about to attempt is unprecedented. It carries significant risk. But the alternative is to wait passively while this entity erodes our ability to function, to survive. Dr. Hanson's theory offers a chance, however slim, to change the equation. We are explorers. We are scientists. And sometimes that means taking a leap into the void. Trust your training. Trust each other. Moreau out." Searzan observed the preparations with a quiet, profound sorrow. He had made his objections known, passionately and repeatedly. Now he seemed to have resigned himself to what he considered inevitable Cathar doom, brought about by human recklessness. Yet he didn't flee to his quarters. He remained in the observation gallery overlooking the communications hub, a silent, willowy sentinel of ancient fear. His bioluminescent skin was a dull, bruised gray, the color of Cathar morning. Finally, the moment arrived. All non-essential personnel were secured in designated safe zones. The main array was powered, thrumming with barely contained energy. Lena stood before the primary transmission console, her face illuminated by its glow. Jax stood beside her, hands clasped behind his back. Chief Volkov gave a thumbs up from her engineering station. "All systems nominal, Commander," Volkov reported, her voice tight. "Power core is stable. Array is locked on target. We're as ready as we'll ever be." Lena looked at Jax. Commander? Jax met her gaze. For a fleeting second, he saw not just a brilliant scientist, but the embodiment of humanity's often irrational hope. He nodded slowly. Proceed, Dr. Hanson. Take your leap. Lena turned back to the console. Her fingers hovered over the activation sequence. This was it. A message in a bottle, thrown into an ocean of spacetime, aimed at a consciousness that might not even recognize its existence, or worse, might swat it aside like an annoying insect. She took a steadying breath, the weight of countless what-ifs pressing down. Then, with a firm, decisive movement, she initiated the broadcast. A deep hum resonated through the deck plates of the station as the array discharged its first pulse of coherent mathematical thought into the shimmering alien presence that hung in the void. The void, for now, remained silent. The first pulses of Lena's intricate message radiated out from Beacon Station's main array, invisible lines of pure information cast into the distorted spacetime surrounding the Chronomist entity. On the command deck and in the communications hub, the silence was so thick it felt like a physical pressure. Every eye was glued to the sensor displays, searching for any sign, any reaction, from the shimmering anomaly that filled the main view screen. Seconds stretched into an eternity. The Chronomist continued its silent, unsettling dance, its form vaguely amoebic, constantly shifting, the space around it warping and buckling in ways that made the eyes ache. The station's internal temporal disturbances, the flickering lights, and odd gravitational pulls seemed to intensify for a terrifying moment. A low groan vibrated through the station's structure, a sound of immense stress. Power fluctuations in the primary conduits. Chief Volkov snapped from her station, her knuckles white on her console. The entity's field it's pushing back, Commander. Zirzan in the observation gallery let out a soft, despairing sound, a Cathar expression of profound dread. His bioluminescent skin pulsed a sickly, chaotic green. Abort the transmission, Commander, he urged, his voice amplified into the hub. It is angered. You will destroy us all. Jax's hand instinctively moved towards the master abort switch for the array, his heart pounding. Had Lena been wrong? Had they just provoked the incomprehensible? The faces of his crew, pale and strained, looked to him for guidance, for salvation. Hold, Chief, Jax commanded, his voice strained but firm, his eyes darting between the roiling image of the Chronomist and Lena's face. Dr. Hanson, report. Lena was utterly still, her entire being focused on the torrent of data flowing onto her screens. Her brow was furrowed in intense concentration, her lips moving silently as she processed the incoming information. The chaotic interference is increasing, but there's something else. Wait. Suddenly she gasped, her eyes widening. The patterns, Commander, the patterns it's emitting are changing. The base frequencies are shifting. They're aligning. On the main view screen, the violent, erratic shimmering of the Chronomist entity seemed to hesitate. The aggressive temporal flux around its edges didn't vanish, but its intensity subtly lessened, the chaotic ripples smoothing out into something more rhythmic. The groaning from the station's superstructure diminished. What does that mean, Doctor? Jax pressed, his hand still hovering near the abort. I think... Lena's voice was breathy with disbelief and dawning wonder. I think it's listening. The sequences we're broadcasting, it's not treating them as noise or an attack, it's processing them, and its own emissions are starting to mirror the mathematical structures we're sending out. Not perfectly, but it's an echo, Commander, a responsive echo. As she spoke, the change became more apparent. The angry, unpredictable warping of space-time around the Chronomist began to settle into a more organized, though still profoundly alien series of pulses and waves. The aggressive spikes in temporal distortion that had been plaguing Beacon Station started to dampen. It was like watching a furious storm begin to calm, the winds easing, the thunder receding into a distant rumble. The energy readings are stabilizing, Volkov reported, her voice laced with astonishment. The stress on the station's framework is decreasing. What in the void is happening? Lena was now working furiously at her console, her fingers flying. a triumphant, almost manic grin spreading across her face. It's a feedback loop. It's analyzing our signal and modifying its own output in response. It's like tuning an instrument. We send a C-sharp, it sends back something resembling a C-sharp, but in its own temporal octave. She initiated a new sequence, more complex this time, incorporating elements of the very patterns the Chronomist had just generated. Let's see if it can follow a more complex melody. The response was almost immediate. The Chronomist entity seemed to coalesce further, its shimmering form becoming slightly more defined, less diffuse. The patterns it emitted shifted again, adopting the new complexities Lena had introduced, weaving them into its own alien symphony of space-time fluctuations. On the bridge, a collective gasp went through the assembled crew. The fear hadn't vanished, but it was now mixed with a profound, overwhelming sense of awe. They were witnessing something no one in the galaxy had ever imagined possible. Not a battle, not a defense, but a dialogue of sorts, with a Chronomist. Zirzan stood frozen in the gallery, his intricate skin patterns shifting from their agitated state to a cascade of soft, wondering blues and silvers, colors Lena had only ever seen in Cathar depictions of deep reverence or profound philosophical insight. He slowly sank into a chair, his gaze fixed on the now almost gracefully pulsing entity on the view screen. The Cathar word he whispered was too soft for the comms to pick up, but it looked like a prayer. Jax finally lowered his hand from the abort switch, a slow smile spreading across his face. He looked at Lena, who was practically vibrating with intellectual excitement and relief. "Dr. Hanson," he said, his voice filled with an emotion he rarely showed, "I believe you just taught the galaxy how to sing to the stars." The first echo had been heard, and it was not a sound of war, but the beginning of a conversation beyond their wildest dreams. The oppressive weight of fear that had hung over Beacon Station for days began to lift, replaced by the fragile, exhilarating lightness of a new, unthinkable hope. The hours that followed the first echo were a whirlwind of intense, focused activity aboard Beacon Station. Dr. Lena Hanson and her team, now working with a renewed sense of purpose that bordered on elation, didn't dare break the fragile connection they had established with the Chronomist entity. They worked in shifts, constantly monitoring its responses, subtly adjusting their own broadcasts, learning the strange, silent language of space-time harmonics. It was, as Lena had described, like tuning an infinitely complex instrument. They discovered that certain mathematical progressions, particularly those based on recursive functions and transcendental numbers, seemed to soothe the entity, its disruptive temporal field calming significantly. Other sequences, especially those with chaotic or dissonant elements, caused it to flare with agitated energy, a clear sign of displeasure or perhaps simple incompatibility. Slowly, a clearer picture of the Chronomists began to emerge, not from any direct communication in a linguistic sense, but from the nature of their responses and the underlying structure of their song. Lena theorized they were indeed ancient, likely existing for eons in planes of reality with more dimensions than humanity could easily conceive. Their passage or interaction with three-dimensional space was not an invasion, but perhaps more, akin to a colossal creature unknowingly brushing against a delicate spider web. The resulting vibrations, the temporal distortions, the fear, were byproducts, not intent. The fear itself, Lena explained to Jax during a brief respite, her eyes shining with discovery. It's likely a biological defense mechanism from our end. Our minds, our very cellular structure, are attuned to linear time. When that's violently disrupted, even as a side effect of something passing by, our brains interpret it as a fundamental threat. The Chronomists aren't projecting fear. We're experiencing it as a natural reaction to their incompatible presence. Jax listened, a sense of profound awe settling over him. So, we've spent millennia terrified of something that might not even know we're here, or at least doesn't intend us harm. Precisely, Lena said. And by singing to it in a mathematical language it understands, or that resonates with its own structure, we're essentially creating a smoother path for it, guiding its vibrational impact, making its presence less disruptive to our local spacetime. The practical effects were undeniable. Under the influence of Beacon Station's continuous, refined broadcast, the Chronomist entity, hanging in the Etherian veil, began to change. Its vast, shimmering form seemed to grow more coherent, less erratic. The dangerous temporal anomalies around it subsided almost entirely. Then, slowly, with a grace that was utterly alien, yet undeniably peaceful, it began to recede. It didn't vanish in a flash, but rather seemed to drift away, like a great celestial ship turning towards a distant star, its light dimming as it moved further into the depths of the veil. As it withdrew, the last vestiges of temporal instability aboard Beacon Station vanished. Clocks ticked in perfect synchrony. Lights burned steady and true. A collective sigh of relief, so profound it was almost tangible, swept through the station. Then came the news that brought tears to many eyes, including Zirzan's. Long-range sensors, now able to penetrate the formerly chaotic region around, Viridian Outpost picked up faint but regular energy signatures. Life support, basic comms traffic. A follow-up probe, dispatched with cautious optimism, confirmed it. Viridian was damaged, its people traumatized, but they were alive. The Chronomist that had enveloped their colony had receded almost simultaneously with the one near Beacon Station. It seemed Lena's song had resonated far beyond their immediate vicinity, or perhaps the entities were interconnected in ways they couldn't yet fathom. A celebration erupted on Beacon Station, spontaneous and joyous. Laughter echoed in corridors that had only days before been filled with hushed fear. Commander Jax Moreau found himself shaking hands, clapping shoulders, a grin fixed on his face that he couldn't have suppressed if he'd tried. He found Lena in the comms hub, quietly observing the final sensor readings of the departing Chronomist. "You did it, Doctor," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You actually did it." Lena turned, a weary but deeply satisfied smile on her face. "We did it, Commander. Everyone who kept this station running, everyone who trusted a wild idea." Zirzan entered the hub then, his movements no longer stiff with fear but imbued with a new, thoughtful grace. His bioluminescent skin was a calm, steady pattern of deep blues and vibrant purples, colors the Cathar associated with enlightenment and newfound understanding. He approached Lena and performed a gesture of profound respect, a slow bow with one hand placed over his primary heart. "Dr. Hanson," he said, his melodic voice resonating with sincerity. "My people, we have feared the Chronomists for longer than humanity has sailed the stars. We built walls of terror around them, called them unthinkable, unknowable. Your human audacity, your willingness to look beyond the shroud of fear. You have shown us that what lies beyond is not necessarily a monster, but perhaps just a different kind of song." He paused, his gaze sweeping towards the view screen where the Etherian veil now shimmered with its original, untroubled beauty. "You have not just saved Beacon Station, or Viridian. You have given the galaxy a new path. You have taught us that sometimes the greatest courage is not to fight the storm, but to learn its music." Lena felt a warmth spread through her, more profound than any scientific triumph. This was the true fuck yeah moment, not just solving a puzzle, but easing an ancient fear, opening a door to understanding where once there was only terror. The days that followed, Jax's official report to Galactic Command sent ripples throughout the known galaxy. Skepticism was quickly followed by stunned belief as Cathar officials from Viridian corroborated the events. Teams of scientists from dozens of species were already clamoring for Lena's data, for the songbook that had tamed a Chronomist. Humanity, often seen as reckless upstarts, too young and too impulsive for their own good, were suddenly viewed in a new light. As the species uniquely capable of thinking so far outside the box they'd ended up in another dimension altogether. Their bizarre combination of optimism and a tendency to ask, "Why not try this ridiculously dangerous thing?" had this time led to a breakthrough that promised to change the galaxy for the better. Lena Hanson stood once more in the Arboretum, looking out at the Etherian veil. It no longer seemed a place of dread, but one of immense, beautiful mystery. The whispers of the Chronomists were still there, she knew, but they were no longer the screams of an unseen enemy. They were the faint, distant echoes of a different kind of existence, a song waiting to be understood. And humanity, it turned out, were pretty good listeners once they got past the urge to just shoot at things. The universe was vast and full of wonders, and for the first time in a long time, the dominant feeling among the crew of Beacon Station as they gazed into the unknown was not fear, but an exhilarating, boundless curiosity.